Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah, and I'm honored and excited to introduce Ms. Kitty DiMartino today, who has had a long and illustrious career in both politics and the media. Ms. DiMartino works as Senior Advisor to the Albright Stonebridge Group, which focuses on the intersection of public policy and business. She previously served as Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs in the Obama administration. She was also the Communications Director for Secretary Albright when she served as Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. Before working in politics, she was the Vice President, Chief of Staff to the President and CEO of Discovery Communications, which is a parent company of channels like Discovery, TLC, and Animal Planet. I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing her insights today, so please join me in welcoming Ms. DiMartino.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank all of you for having me here today. And I guess thanks to Secretary Albright for asking me to participate. So as Sarah mentioned, I've known Secretary Albright for a long period of time. I feel very fortunate to have worked for her while she was Secretary of State and while she was Ambassador to the UN, and then now she's running her own firm, Albright Stonebridge Group, and I've been lucky enough to rejoin her at Albright Stonebridge Group. So at Albright Stonebridge Group, I focus primarily on infrastructure and on Africa. As Sarah mentioned, I had been at Discovery Communications, and in between having worked in the public sector, that was my sort of private sector jaunt, and I became a true believer and a real passionate believer in sort of what private sector can do and how it can change societies and change policies as well. The CEO of Discovery, who I worked for, when she decided to step down, she decided to sort of use her skills in building businesses to launch a private equity fund to invest in small and medium-sized enterprises in Africa. And when she did that, I didn't even know what private equity was, but she called and asked if I would join her and form the fund, and I said, I looked it up on Wikipedia while I was talking to her on the phone and said, sure, yeah, I'll do it. And so I sort of took that risk, but it allowed me to go form a fund, spend a lot of time on the ground in Africa. It was an area I had already had familiarity with from the State Department, from the UN, of course, and at Discovery, because it's the kind of media company that doesn't have studios, but the world is its studio, you can imagine how much programming was resourced from Africa. So we had a lot of familiarity of operating in those markets, and when we spent time on the ground, we became even more aware of what the opportunities were, and what I was able to see by sourcing these deals on the ground was also sort of what the infrastructure challenges in Africa were and also what the opportunities were. So after I went back into the Obama administration and sort of did another run in government, Secretary Albright asked me to come and join so that I could help on both Africa and on infrastructure. And as it turns out, more often than not, the clients that we are helping in Africa are either in the infrastructure sector or the delivery of their product or service is completely and totally dependent on infrastructure. So there's sort of a nice melding of worlds there. Just in terms of a little bit more about me so that you have a sense of sort of how we're going to work this today. So I know Secretary Albright, who is Wellesley grad, A++ sort of personality and super achiever. I had the opportunity to work for Secretary Clinton, not sort of in the same, very close capacity as I work for Secretary Albright, but sort of got the sense of the A++ culture. One of my best friends from home, from South Dakota, came to Wellesley. Certainly A++, and a riot, just a complete and total riot. So I sort of have the sense of both the breadth of intellectual curiosity and also sort of the fun that can be had while you're nailing a briefing book. And so at any rate, I somewhat have a sense of what you may bring to the conversation, and what I certainly hope that we have a good volley and dialogue today. But also, I'm the youngest of 9 kids. I'm fairly informal, and so please feel free to interrupt at any moment, because that is absolutely the world that I came from. So at any point, don't feel like you have to raise your hand or anything, just jump in and participate in the conversation. Because I am part of a consulting firm, I have a deck. So that will kind of structure the conversation, but we can absolutely feel free to go off from it. And I also have a sense from Joe and Joanne that you guys have had some really good conversations already that have been very different than maybe what a consultant would talk about. I think you talked about literature, is that right? Did people love that conversation? Yeah. What were some of the main things that you talked about when you were talking about literature and infrastructure, or how it connected?
One of the things we talked about that I liked a lot was the perils of using some imaginative literature or works as things to inform policy, because some pieces that are very moving and influential may be more propaganda pieces. And so that was interesting. And our speaker was citing works like Uncle Tom's Cabin, which it did exactly what it needed to do, but it sort of knew the answer already. And he was distinguishing between interesting works that sort of don't know the answer already as being good ways to think about problems that are currently out there. So that was interesting.
Oh, that's great. And that probably has a lot of, sort of intersects a lot in one of the subsectors of infrastructure, social infrastructure. And maybe we can get to that a little bit too. But I'm just going to go through, give you a sense of what areas we're going to cover so that you have a sense of where we're coming to. But sort of why infrastructure, and I think you guys have already done a lot of reading, and you probably have already had these conversations starting yesterday, but we'll go over just some of the top line bits of it. The landscape, sort of what the big numbers are out there in the infrastructure space and the infrastructure sector globally, and sort of where the growth is, and some trends that you're probably reading about as you're reading about megacities and urbanization and sort of what's happening. And then sort of, addressing the challenge of infrastructure delivery going forward. So those are sort of the roadmap, if you will. So obviously, infrastructure is the key economic enabler. And this was, I have a daughter who's in 6th grade who is doing ancient history. And so she's studying Mesopotamia and all of these, great cultures of antiquity. And, it's not until you start building the dikes that hold back the floodwaters, that allow you to build these little bricks, that allow you to build the cities, that you actually start to get economic activity, right? And so, you can look at it through, through ancient history, but certainly in modern culture, modern society, it is the economic enabler, and cities are where economic activity takes place. And so maybe most, for the discussion today, we can also be thinking a lot about urbanization and infrastructure in cities and these mega cities that are popping up around. And so making the right investments is completely critical, and making the right investments as we look to what's happening in the world. By 2050, we'll have a 9 billion person world that will be growing significantly. So much of that growth is happening in the South and in the East, where some of the infrastructure needs are greatest. And it's also happening at a time when the world is growing. And so you're seeing things like Superstorm Sandy or Katrina or floods in Lagos or in Dakar that are having real implications, not only for communities and the people who live there, but for the public policy practitioners who are trying to strike a new path forward for perhaps their citizens or their country or the economic growth sort of well-being of the people. It's clearly a national priority, and you're seeing it pop up in a lot of different fora. So you're seeing when the Russians were the hosts of the G20, you had a high-level panel on infrastructure. You had B20 investment, an infrastructure task force, and you had the president prioritizing it in the State of the Union address. It was one of the first times that the president had really laid that out so concretely. And since then, he's had more than a dozen domestic trips where they've done they've highlighted infrastructure, whether it's at a port in Florida or elsewhere. And so it's a really, really big issue. Governors and mayors really play the critical role. I mean, it's kind of common sense, right? This is what governors and mayors get elected on, whether you fix the potholes, right? Whether you've got a road that can allow you to conduct commercial activity, et cetera. So they're really critical players in this. But you also have a cohort of decision makers that are at all levels, and you will be at all of these levels. I mean, I expect that there will be a finance minister, that there is a finance minister amongst you, that there is an urban planner, and an environment, from environmental activists and others, you really have a cohort of leaders who are becoming leaders in infrastructure. And a good example of that, Michael Bloomberg can kind of do almost anything. And there are people who are as wealthy as him, but he really, uses his wealth and his positions in public policy and other things to really make a difference. And he's done that through his leadership role, and is really, he now has stepped down. But there was a recent New York Times article. I don't know if any of you saw it, about what he plans to do with a cohort of people who worked for him in the mayor's office, who worked almost exclusively on infrastructure, who are now going to form a group called Bloomberg Advisors, who will be able to go around globally and sort of provide some of the advice and consulting that they've done in New York City on green infrastructure, green building, on things like the highway and walkway and all of that globally. You also have, as Secretary Albright had asked me to come on and participate in infrastructure. I mean, first, maybe I should have started with, I'm not an infrastructure expert. So I thought, I saw these issues that were preventing greater economic growth for the companies that we were trying to allocate capital to in Africa. But, I didn't probably, and maybe you didn't until you started this winter session, think of it as such a prevalent issue. But I feel like all the time, the Secretary and I will frequently say, is it just because we've partnered with McKenzie and we're now starting to do this global infrastructure initiative, or is it suddenly infrastructure everywhere? And I jokingly say that she's the best staffer I've ever had, because she sends me clips all of the time saying, hey, did you read the Financial Times today? Did you see what they're doing in Turkey on infrastructure? Did you see what Lula just said? Did you see what Rousseff just said, et cetera? But you see it everywhere. In Bloomberg Business Week, a media is a business, a business publication, business trade. So yeah, you would expect that, right? But you also see people like Tom Friedman who are writing a lot about infrastructure. And one of the pieces that sort of struck me, because it had so much to do with national security, which is obviously where Secretary Albright's expertise resides, was a piece that he did, and then a very long series that he's done on water security, where he talked about the water scarcity in Yemen being directly related to conflicts in Yemen. And he starts off the column in a hospital where talking to a 25-year-old who's just been shot over water scarcity issues. And they're able to actually trace the ability to recruit for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to where there is a lack of water infrastructure or increasing water scarcity. And so you see how tightly woven together these issues are. And I think that was something that had always been apparent to Secretary Albright and I it's sort of in a different context. I mean, when you're the Secretary of State, you have a foreign policy toolbox, and Secretary Albright teaches a course on that at Georgetown. Certainly one of the tools in that toolbox is development assistance. And for the United States, at any rate, and for governments increasingly around the world, providing development assistance in the area of infrastructure is something that we've done for decades, if not longer. And so, when Secretary Albright was in office, it was not uncommon for us to make an announcement while she was on the road of $200 million in Bosnia to reopen a bridge between a part of Bosnia and Croatia that was not able to have commercial connections because of bridges being bombed out during the war, et cetera. So it was something that was always a part of the conversation and definitely well aware that it was part of the toolbox. But again, I think because of the pressures of sort of the growing and warming world that we live in, it's really become much more front and center. And infrastructure has become something like a pressing global issue in the way that sort of climate change is. So that sort of provides sort of the why infrastructure and maybe why Albright Stonebridge Group is focused on it, or why the Secretary is having you during your winter session focus on these issues. Just to give you a little bit of data, and again, I think you've read a lot before you came in, but again, some of those top line numbers, the global infrastructure spend totals about $3 trillion annually. And the big issue here, and this is where you start talking about public-private partnerships and the need for stakeholder engagement and stakeholder relationships, is the 70%, approximately 70% of the spend for infrastructure is by the public sector, but the public sector relies entirely on the private sector for the delivery of infrastructure. It's the private sector engineering and construction firms that build it. In many cases, you have private financiers who are stepping in, especially as you have these balance sheets in many countries that just can't sustain the investment that they need in order to either maintain GDP levels or grow them. And so there's really a whole web of stakeholders that need to participate. Yes, did somebody have a question? No, okay. So, in terms of some of these trends, though, what you're seeing is, first of all, there are trends in terms of where the biggest spends or investment are. That does not mean that the United States or North America or Europe is that we're stopping infrastructure investment by any means. It's just that this shift of the marketplace is moving from Europe and North America to Asia. And you see China as the biggest investor. I think we have some participants from China who are here, who probably are very familiar with the millions of cranes that are up in the cities and these landscapes. We were at a meeting with who will be our new ambassador to China, Max Bacchus, who said, when you stand in China and you look at the landscape of all of these cranes, you realize this is the 2014 version of the aircraft carrier. That what's happening with that economy is just amazing, and it's infrastructure that is, again, the key economic enabler there. So you're seeing, these changes. You're also seeing so many more mega projects. So you're seeing these huge structures being built in the Middle East. And more often, you're seeing the records and infrastructure being broken in these emerging economies. So you're seeing, the tallest building in Dubai. As soon as they announced that, then Jeddah said that they were commencing a building that would be taller. And so you're seeing more and more. So, but, when we talk about infrastructure, what are we really talking about? Because this is a conversation that some of my colleagues will have. The Secretary keeps saying, to me, it's such an all-encompassing conversation. And are you talking about hospitals and are you talking about schools? Yes, we are. But you sort of break it down. So you have transport, infrastructure that includes, sort of what may be the classic infrastructure of roads, bridges, railway, and transport. Your utilities, which is the power infrastructure. And Carol Browner, who's going to be speaking to you later, or you're going to be doing presentations to her. She is has a wealth of information on power, on both traditional and renewable, on water, wastewater. She always asks me, are you talking about wastewater or are you talking about water? And oil and gas. Then you get to the social infrastructure of healthcare, elder care facilities, colleges, universities, sports infrastructure, which is increasingly becoming an issue. I mean, not just in Brazil right now, where actually it's causing a little bit, the sort of social unrest has eased off a bit, but some of the sports infrastructure there was actually causing some of the Brazilian Spring problems, and then real estate. So I don't know, maybe we'll, I don't know if we have to talk so much about this, except for to say that, again, we believe that in order to build the amount of infrastructure that will be required for a 9 billion person world, there's no one solution. There's no silver bullet. There's going to have to be a lot of innovation and a lot of different partnerships that will be put into place and to be able to deliver it. I think you will be talking about that and sort of working on that as you go through this seminar, and so it will be. I will be very interested in what some of your suggestions and findings are. But essentially what you're going to have to do is get those public-private partnerships together. There are some governments that are actually putting PPP units into place, and those PPP within, it will sit outside of the Ministry of Finance. It sits outside the Ministry of Transportation. In some cases, it reports directly to a deputy prime minister. In some cases, it reports directly to a prime minister. And what that PPP unit will do is be able to what they're able to do is work hand in glove with the private sector, but they're also able to get over some of the obstacles of democracy. So democracy has all of these great benefits, but you have elections every 4 years or 6 years, depending what country you're from, and you end up with decisions that are sometimes made by political timelines instead of what the end user or what citizens or communities need or want. And sometimes if you're able to create, the theory is if you're able to create a PPP unit that's separate from a ministry or that might report directly to a prime minister or a deputy prime minister perhaps, that what you're able to do is depoliticize it just slightly, where you're able to build capacity, bring in a group of professionals that are depoliticized, and then you're able to get your country to a place where you can really come up with bankable infrastructure projects, commercial infrastructure projects that get that financing that is actually out there swirling around the world looking for projects to get a viable and proper return. So that's, I don't think I'll go through the details on that. I think I will go through this just because this probably, go ahead. Yeah.
Question on your slide,
Yeah.
risk and reward. I was wondering if you could talk about that for a minute and maybe give us some insight onto how like financial risks, when you're taking financial risks, for example, if you were trying to work with water, like what are the risks that someone would be taking and what kind of rewards are you talking about in that particular slide?
Well, so it can be a number of different things. That's a great question, Fiona, because the risks and rewards really cover sort of, you can organize your thinking sort of almost into those stakeholders pieces, because sort of each of the stakeholders has risk and rewards, whether you're the end user, whether you're the citizen, or whether you're the perhaps bureaucrat or the public policy leader, or whether you're an investor, or whether you're the engineering and construction firm perhaps involved in it. There are the risks and rewards. So, for instance, just if you took one of those groups, if you took the engineering and construction firm, they may be working with a municipality to deliver drinking water. That's going to be a huge expenditure to them to put in the technology, the manpower, the thought leadership, and what they need to know is that they're going to get, they can either get paid directly from the municipality. They can put in a tender and say, it's going to cost $210 million. This is what we're going to get paid. Or, again, different municipalities are looking at this very differently and are saying, okay, so should this just be that we raise revenue, that we pay a one-time fee to an engineering and construction firm, and so we sort of the municipality sort of bears the full cost of it, or and they pay for it either by raising revenues or charging the end user, right? Or you can have the engineering and construction firm perhaps come in as a partner to the municipality, take on and it be in a revenue sharing sort of model with the municipality, so that company X perhaps gets, the municipality covers its outlay of capital for the build, and at the point at which it covers its outlay of capital, then the upside goes to the company, and it just becomes revenue at that point for the company. So there are different ways of allocating, and actually, quite frankly, that's one of the sort of big issues among public policymakers, investors, community activists, is sort of how do we, so where do we push that risk reward allocations throughout the life cycle of a project? Because those are sort of the big issues, right? And you have sort of different cultural concerns and aspects that come into play, where some people say, well, water is a fundamental right, right? And so should somebody be profiting off of the delivery of an essential good or service? And you have many players who will look at it and say, we're providing a good or a service, and we should have the ability to make a profit off of that, right? So, but it's a really good question, and in some ways it gets to the nut of what the whole issue is, which is where do you shift that risk reward along the whole life cycle, whether that is a 3-year project life cycle or a 20-year project life cycle. And that's sort of what investors and managing directors of big private equity firms that are investing solely in infrastructure are sitting in boardrooms today saying, where do we put the risk? Where do we manage, how do we manage it, and where do we put it in the whole life cycle of our investment into this project? And that, and it's actually, that goes for infrastructure, and it kind of goes for a lot of other things, but yeah. Yes?
Quick question that I was hoping you could help me with. I'm not an econ major, and I don't know much of these terms. You've mentioned economic enabler quite a lot, about how infrastructure is the cornerstone to economic development. And I'm just wondering what that means exactly. Like, who is it enabling? Is infrastructure the economic enabler for like individuals? Are there standards of living increasing, or are we talking mostly about like a country's GDP, a company's profits and revenues?
Well, I think it kind of depends on how you calculate. It's sort of, progress is subjective. So it can be a little bit on how you calculate it. I mean, I would say economic is the key economic enabler really for everyone. And I think this is one of the things, again, that became very appealing to me personally about infrastructure, because, again, when the secretary asked me to start working on it, and we were both interested in it, but I'm not an engineer, so I'm kind of fascinated by bridges, right? I'm fascinated by tall structures, but does like make my pulse quicken? Maybe not. But what sort of made me so interested were sort of the very human elements of infrastructure, the very human parts of it, which is, sure, it's bridges, it's tunnels, it's hospitals even, right? But it is, and especially maybe not especially, just everywhere, in developing communities, infrastructure is the ability of a household to be able to bring clean water into the home, or to be able to power their home so that their children can study at night, so that they can, the road that gets them to school. So it's very personal. I mean, the secretary, we're sort of committed to democracy in our office. So the secretary is sort of big, she's a big D Democrat and a little D Democrat. And she often says, democracy has to produce results. People want to vote, but they also want to eat. And I think as we've worked on this, I would say, yeah, but, in order to eat, the infrastructure has to be in place, right? Or people want to vote, but they also want to get to work, right? People want to, I would argue that humans have common aspirations and people want to be productive. And I think that infrastructure is what allows individuals to be productive. Then when you roll it up into other entities, it allows municipalities to be productive, companies, countries. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jenna. I was just wondering, the second bullet point you have about the governments being increasingly budget constrained and then looking to the private sector. And I was just wondering or thinking about the relationship between private and public, and the government's supposed to be taking care obviously of public interests, but then what are what are there are definitely advantages to like having the private sector providing financing, but what are the potential dangers of that also of like, the government kind of like being, if they're receiving financing from the private sector, then obviously the private sector is going to want maybe something in return, or like what goes into like looking at, I guess, like the credibility of that financial support, or like which private sector would still allow the government to
Yeah.
like cater to the interests of the people and not like rely on or be beholden to a particular private interest.
Yeah, no, those are good. Those are great questions. So I would say, first of all, private sector participation, whether it's through investment or through building, through planning, it's not a gift to public sector. I mean, they do have an interest, and most of the time that interest is in delivering profit or achieving a financial return. And here's what I will say is that especially some of the biggest institutional investors in infrastructure tend to be the big pension plans, right? So Canada's pension plans, which are very well financed, very well run, just remarkable. And some of Northern Europe's pension plans, those are the big institutional investors in infrastructure. The state pension plans in the United States. So California, teachers pension plan, Texas teachers, the big ones out there. They allocate capital in many cases into infrastructure projects because pension plans tend to be able to have what's called a patient return, or they can work on patient capital, meaning that they have a very long time horizon over which they can get that return on investment because they've been around for a long time and they're not going anywhere because they're going to be paying those pensions, right, to all of their members. And so, so in aggregate, you've got sort of regular people who are just investing wholesale in infrastructure, right? And you want to see those pension plans get a return on their investment, because by them getting their pension plans means that teachers have a reliable source of income well beyond their the number of years that they're teaching, that postal workers, that all of us, right? All of us in a 401k, or all of your parents who are in 401k, et cetera. So investors in infrastructure are very often very sort of common people, but rolled up into something very large, like a country-wide pension plan or a statewide pension plan, or others. I mean, it's clear that they're looking for a return on their investment, or they're looking to maximize profit, which is again a responsibility that companies have to their shareholders, which again, maybe the 401k plan or the pension plan that you are in or that your parents are in relies on that investment, right? So, so that in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. Where can you run into problems, though? Well, you can run into problems in that, and infrastructure is kind of, it is very difficult, right? And it's a unique sector, but you end up in some cases where, and you'll see increasingly in the United States and elsewhere in other markets, where you have private sector players, because those balance sheets are just shrinking. You have the global financial crisis, a number of different things that cause balance sheets to shrink, right? And so what you ended up with a scenario in many places where the private sector was sort of going up the value chain in infrastructure delivery, and so not only perhaps building the toll road, but operating it and getting the revenue from it as well. Well, sometimes when you build a new toll road, and this is where communications and media comes into it, you don't actually get immediate, you have to involve that complex web of stakeholders, because sometimes you don't get immediate usage on a toll road. I mean, right now in Washington, I just came up from Washington, and they're raising the Virginia part of the Capitol Beltway has a express toll. Not the Maryland part, but the Virginia part does. When I live in Maryland, when I go out to Virginia, I always use that express toll. I mean, it's $3 extra, whatever. I go 10 times as fast. It's the greatest thing. There are a lot of people who don't want to pay the $3 extra, right? And so one of the reasons why I go 10 times as fast is because there aren't that many people using it. So there aren't that many people using it, so they have to increase. So they've had to, in a much quicker time frame, increase the rate. Now they're interviewing people at the gas pump and all of that stuff who are like, I've had it, I'm never going to use it again, you know. And so what you have in some cases, the public sector is running those toll roads. In other cases, it is the private sector. So you might have Macquarie, which is a very large company, Australian, just by the way, that both has built, has operated, and is receiving the revenues for a toll road in Louisiana. They can't get the usage out of it, and now they're going to pull out. They can't, even if they've changed their financial model. Probably they have somebody in a boardroom, probably fresh out of college, who's doing the financial modeling, like kind of on a daily basis. Like, if we could get the usage up to X, then would we be able to deliver a profit by Y? And they can't do it. And so then you end up with, public sector sort of having to step in and say, oh God, we got to take this thing over. So those can be some of the risks. Yes.
My name is Barrett, and I just had a question related to toll roads in particular.
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of countries and about half the United States that doesn't incorporate toll roads. The whole West Coast doesn't. And I was wondering if that's because it's not in their interest somehow funding it, or what your take is on why they choose not to incorporate this particular kind of infrastructure. Is it having to do with not being able to find private sector that is interested in doing this, or some other reason?
You know, it's a good question, and I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on it. I don't exactly know the answer, so this is really more sort of hypothesizing. I think it has a lot to do with population. Right? So where you see high concentration of population, you see toll roads. Also sort of, again, cultural tendencies, right? Which, if you grew up on the East Coast or the Northeast corridor, it's just not even an issue to use a toll road, and probably in some other foreign countries. But in places that lack population, they get the federal highway funding. I mean, every state gets their federal highway funding, right? So then you just have to, you have to figure out how you're going to fill the delta on what you get from the federal highway administration and what your use is in your region, your state, your municipality, and then you have to figure out what the right mix of funding is for consumers or users in your area. But maybe other people have. So going through some of the trends, and you probably cover this in a lot of different classes that you're in, just sort of, but I mean, some of the things that are happening, you've got the, what is called the Great Rebalancing. The economic center of gravity is shifting from the developed world to the developing. In order to sustain wealth, you see production needing to increase exponentially over time, and those countries that have been able to do that are the countries that have been able to see really sustained GDP growth. Technology is certainly a huge part of it, and it's interesting because while technology is used extensively in engineering, obviously, and in infrastructure, there are a lot of people in the sector who really argue that the innovation within the sector has not been what it needs to be, and that sort of affects that productivity imperative. I've highlighted this one, the pricing the planet and resource scarcity, partly, and I've put in a couple of follow-on slides, partly because of Carol Browner being the guest lecturer for you. This is obviously something that is really of focus to her and that she is an expert on. And so just as you're going through the seminar, just as you're thinking about some of these issues, just keep in mind that these will be the issues that, of course, always pop for Carol. And then the market state. So, these public-private partnerships, rather than they're going to be more front and center. You're going to hopefully see more private, or you may see more private sector participation, but you certainly see the role of the state continuing to be there. And you know, especially when you look at, for instance, the Japanese Prime Minister who just did a trip to, or who's on a trip now to Africa. I mean, the amount of development assistance that the Japanese are committing to infrastructure specifically in Africa, for instance, and again, I work on Africa, so I'll tend to have a lot of references to it, is really amazing. And China, obviously, huge infrastructure investments and projects. Well, investments, not because they're looking for a particular profit off of an individual project, but there are other things that come with the infrastructure that's provided. And then, you know, but really you see in Malaysia's the largest FDI investor in Africa right now. So what do these trends mean? It means that you're going to end up seeing these emerging markets are really going to see just really terrific growth. And you see that in capital markets, among the emerging market funds. Tons of growth, and I think you read a lot on urbanization. So, you know, if you have questions on any of these, ask me. But again, you know, in terms of pricing the planet, you know, we think that this is a real opportunity because for people who want to work in this sector or invest in this sector, what you're going to end up seeing is that, and you can probably feel it in your conversations and in sort of your aspirations as a consumer. What you sort of want are policymakers to have more green regulations in place. You sort of, you know, it looks good to see that Mike Bloomberg has a green infrastructure plan for the city. It feels good when you go to New York City and you've got all of the cabs that are, you know, or so many of the cabs that are, you know, renewable cars, et cetera. So you're going to see that, but you're going to see that, and when you look at Superstorm Sandy and floods in Lagos and you know, Fukushima, et cetera, climate resilient infrastructure is going to become critical. So those are challenges to mount, but they're also opportunities. So the size of, you know, first of all, it's interesting because you had a couple of years there, or more than a couple, where climate change was obviously being really questioned. But I think that I feel as if the climate change problem is really back on the agenda in a very central way. Again, you had the president talk about it in his State of the Union address and some of the very first interviews that he did for the second term when he talked about what were his top 3 priorities. Climate change was one of the 3. So it's really back on the agenda. And then that creates opportunities in terms of what can be done in terms of investment and in terms of green building and clean energy and sustainable infrastructure. So those are opportunities, again, for investors and for people who want to do, it's opportunities for community activists, it's opportunities for, you know, policymakers. It presents a really great opportunity, although it's a challenge. So addressing the challenge. So essentially, and again, I said that we'd spend a little bit of time on this. What ASG, what Albright Stonebridge Group has done is really sort of, we've partnered with McKenzie and Company to look at the issue of infrastructure. One of the reasons why we've partnered with McKenzie and Company is because they have the McKenzie Global Institute, which is this just army of analysts who crunch data and look at a lot of issues, and that analysis is very valuable to public policy makers and to decision makers more generally when they're setting out and making policies for their companies, for their countries, for their cities, et cetera. So a lot of the data that you see is coming from McKenzie Global Institute. And essentially, the challenge is that you have a growing and warming world, to 9 billion people by 2050. So that means that in order to sustain GDP levels, in order to meet the infrastructure needs of that growing world, we're going to need to significantly increase infrastructure investment. So right now, I was saying that it's 2.7, about $3 trillion annually. That baseline is going to need to go to at least $4.5 trillion. And in aggregate, that's going to be $57 trillion that needs to be invested by 2030 in order to just meet current infrastructure needs. That's if the world were not growing as it is. But this is, and it's happening at the very same time that you've got reduced government. You've got these challenges on government balance sheets and everything else. So what McKenzie's done is sort of looked at it and said, well, how are we going to meet this challenge? I mean, you can improve, and they've looked at really a mix of different suggestions, and those are improving project selection, streamlining delivery, making the most of existing infrastructure, and optimizing the need. But, and we can go into this in greater detail, but really, in order to do that, because of that complex group of stakeholders that are involved, the reason why they wanted to work with Albright Stonebridge Group is they have a very good sense of what's happening in in the financial community, what's happening within engineering and construction firm. They're a management consulting firm, so they consult with many of these engineering, construction, procurement firms, et cetera. But sort of where there was a missing piece for them was sort of, how do policymakers make decisions? And that's something that Carol and Secretary Albright and Sandy Berger and those of us who work at Albright Stonebridge Group who've spent a lot of time in public sector but have been able to go back and forth between public and private sector and sort of understand what the different demands are, that we're able to sort of help identify what the particular pressures are for people who are in private sector, and then obviously to use our network of relationships to sort of get those discussions going with public sector leaders. So what we did, and I think this is one of the reasons that the Secretary asked me to speak to you, is what we did is we worked together with them to say, okay, what we need to do is really have this discussion on a global basis, because to have a discussion about infrastructure in the United States or to have a discussion about infrastructure challenges in China only, when China is increasingly such a huge investor outside of its own country, et cetera, it's too siloed. And so what we did is work together in partnership with McKenzie to bring together a group of leaders so that we could have this conversation and get leaders and get financiers and get CEOs, chairs and CEOs and sort of civic leaders out of their silos and talking in a much more holistic way about how we're going to deliver the infrastructure that is needed for a growing and warming world. And it was interesting because not only was we did this in Turkey, we launched it in Turkey in 2012. We had about 150 leaders. It was really just an amazing conversation. It was Chatham House rules, which means that it's totally off the record, and so people could be very frank. But having sort of that holistic conversation was really valuable. If you get a group of financiers in a room to talk about infrastructure challenges, they're going to say, it's all the regulators' fault. It's all the public policy guys. If they can just get the regulatory environment right, we'll all be able to make money. People will be, the pension funds will be able to get their returns. Everything will be fine. We just need to get the regulatory environment right. Public policy officials and bureaucrats will often say, the problem is the engineering and construction firms. They're coming in, they deliver the project late or over budget, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was very important to have one streamlined conversation, which we felt like we did, and a couple of things sort of emerged from it, which was really that it was more than just a discussion. It was really sort of sparking a movement on how to better align all of the stakeholders in the infrastructure development, delivery, planning, and operating environment to talk about how we can break through on delivering infrastructure. So the next global gathering will be in Rio in 2014. As you're going through some of the research that you're doing, you might be able to just go to websites and sort of see reports. McKenzie Global Institute has a lot of reports on infrastructure, on productivity, on optimizing productivity and streamlining delivery of infrastructure. This I wanted to put up here because this is sort of relevant to you, it's just a headshot sheet of some of the people who are early participants, and it gives you a sense that it's global and everything else. So Secretary Albright is, when she was first female Secretary of State of the United States. She was not the first female U.S. ambassador to the UN, thank goodness. But she's always had this thing where when she's in office, she wants to make sure that she's, connecting with other female leaders. So when she was the U.S. ambassador to the UN, she said, "Great, let's get all of the female ambassadors together for lunch, and we'll create this little group of the female perm reps to the UN." And she goes back to her apartment expecting to be at a very large luncheon, and there's 5 people. And she's like, she normally hosts lunches that are 30, 40 people. So at the time, I think Trinidad and Tobago had a female perm rep, and the French ambassador was like, "Why do you take her call before you take mine? We're dealing with the Balkans and everything else." But they had made this commitment that they would sort of stick by each other and form a little cohesive club. When she became the Secretary of State, she did the same thing with foreign ministers. And luckily, time was marching on, and so you sort of had a bigger cohort. I think when she did her first foreign ministers dinner, which she did generally during the General Assembly at the UN, there were 10. Then the next year there were 12. It was like the table was getting bigger. It was exciting, right? So we go off to Istanbul to do Global Infrastructure Initiative, and I had a sense before we got there of just how male infrastructure is. But it was amazing. And so we did a lunch sort of to kick off the event. In this case, there was such a lack of women participants that we had said if somebody was like a delegate or like accompanying someone else, they could come to the lunch, So I think we ended up with like 8 or 10, 10, probably 10, 3 of whom were Carol Browner, myself, and Secretary Albright. What's amazing to me is, again, like when you talk about sort of how infrastructure affects you every day in every single thing that you do. When you turn on your phone, when you check a text, when you turn on the light, when you jump in the shower. I mean, it's everything, right? And if you look at the websites of the engineering and construction firms, sometimes there'll be a woman who does HR or communications, sometimes. This would be a challenge to you as you're going through this. If I'm right, if I looked at the 4,000 cell Excel spreadsheet correctly, I don't think that there's a female minister of transportation infrastructure. This is a ministry that's a little bit different per country. It's not like Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So some countries have a Ministry of Public Works. Sometimes it's transportation. Sometimes it's infrastructure. Sometimes it's a number of different things. But there's really a huge lack of women in this. When you do come across women who are master planners, who are in infrastructure finance, they are complete dynamos. The number 2 at Africa Development Bank, the person who heads up infrastructure at Africa Development Bank, is actually a Turkish woman who, she doesn't sleep. I don't know how she does it. She doesn't sleep. But it's amazing. So again, there's a finance minister who's sitting here. That's great. There are female finance ministers. That's great. But, there are engineers, and there are, maybe a minister of transportation or a minister of infrastructure who's sitting here as well. But I just point that out because it is, and you can you can think about that in terms of any issue or any sector out there, right? Education, it affects all of us. But it was amazing to me what a huge lack of women there were. So Madeleine and Lynn are the 2 female. And I'm an accompanying executive so far. McKenzie is great at sort of, again, taking a very complicated issue, great management consulting firm. Maybe some of you will be working for McKenzie in infrastructure. So what they've done is sort of said, okay, this is it's such a huge issue. It's just, how do we grapple with it? And what they did is they sort of created a discussion stream that would be built around these 4 pillars of deciding what to build, optimizing existing infrastructure, looking at sort of how do we do this smarter, faster, better, cheaper, and redefining finance and public accountability. Again, in terms of, there's a couple of different, we can either kind of go into deeper discussion on that. I also have some questions at the end, but we can put a pin in it. We can come back to this if you sort of want to get into deeper discussion on that. But just in terms of maybe kicking off a discussion, I mean, the kinds of things that Secretary Albright kicks off when we pull together, these leaders at GII are things like, how do we do this, right? Which is we're talking about how we trying to pull leaders together to transform the conversation, but how do we have a infrastructure discussion that gets us to an actionable place, right? How do we, why do the same obstacles, power brownouts, water shortages, overcrowded transportation occur so frequently in all of these different countries? And if they are, then is there a way to come up again with a more universal approach or a more universal solution to them? If you can identify a problem, is that a way to stem the problem or address it? And what can we learn from experienced infrastructure leaders? And you sort of look around the world, and it's every system, every country has its own system of government, but it's really this will be some of the things that you maybe are going to be sifting through as you go through these next couple of weeks, which are we ended up having President Kagame from Rwanda, who was participating in the conversation in Turkey, and he was really, really terrific. I mean, what he's done in Rwanda is really, I mean, he has a stated mission that he wants to make Rwanda the Singapore of Africa. It is a very safe, I mean, and they're really following sort of a Singapore model, right? It's very, very safe. The team of urban planners and officials from the ministry that came with him, who were women, they were incredible, and two of them came to our lunch. Are just, I mean, they're really top flight. I mean, they're really great, and they are bringing in the best investors. They are have the best master plans. They're really just doing everything right. But Rwanda is a really unique country. One, it's small, doesn't have the challenges of a place like Brazil, or China, or India, right? Also, Kagame has sort of a very special, almost exalted role, position in Rwanda. And having come out of genocide, and him being in that sort of almost exalted role, it gives him a much freer hand to govern in the way that he wants to govern than perhaps other people who are more susceptible to election cycles. And so sort of every country has its unique particularities, but sort of the idea of GII is to say, okay, but let's not sort of look at each country individually and its challenges or impediments to infrastructure delivery. Let's not look at each sort of group within that group of stakeholders and sort of point to the challenges, but instead, how do we bring this group together and come up with best practices and figure out how we can deliver infrastructure better and not only sustain current GDP levels, but meet the demands that we're going to have to in order to support a 9 billion person world. So with that, I'm completely open to questions, and I'll try to answer what I can. All right. Great. Becca?
My name is Becca Lucas. I'm a senior. And so I am from Chicago and interested in Turkey. So there are big infrastructure projects going on in both places.
Yeah.
And both places have run into a little bit of trouble on the democracy front. A lot of people think Rahm Emanuel, our fantastic mayor, is not transparent in his PPPs. And Erdogan, well, we all saw what happened with the shoeboxes. Anyway, so how do you balance the, someone having an ability like Kagame to not be as susceptible to election cycles and get these large-scale projects done with the backlash that can come from the public when public opinion isn't being respected, as we saw, with the third bridge in Istanbul or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, so there would probably be a range of solutions that could be put on the table, and certainly, hopefully you can brainstorm on some of them as well. I mean, maybe to start with, again, to go back to an idea that that some countries are already instituting, and you could do it at the municipal level too, which is to have almost like an independent, that's why municipalities and why governments around the world do have bureaucrats. Those are the professionals that are there to work on projects and to sort of create continuity through election cycles, right? But to have some sort of, to put in place safeguards for their being able to work on a project continuously, or without the election cycles being a problem. Those PPP, those independent units can be one solution. But the other thing, and this is just, again, we're big proponents of democracy, so elections should come, and they should go, and you should be judged on whether you've delivered, right? But the issue is really then, how do you engage people so that they are sort of there at every step of the process? And this is one of the things that Kagame said too, which was before they started on their huge infrastructure endeavor, he said, I spent probably 14, 16 months in the field. It was so important to be out talking to people before you ever sort of put the financing in place. It all has to work. You have to definitely move all of the pieces along simultaneously, but the stakeholder engagement, the engagement of citizens is incredibly important. And I think the vice mayor of Seoul, who was also a participant, said that if you looked previously, and especially before sort of the digital age, right, which, now you have people who can go online and really sort of change the conversation in a community about a leader or a project, et cetera, right? This vice mayor said that previously, if you looked at an infrastructure project in Seoul that had a typical project life cycle of 5 years, you sort of built it out where you would say, okay, well, we'll do 6 months to 8 months of public sector or public citizen engagement, we'll do this. And you had a very short period of time where you were engaging the public, and almost the entire project life cycle was built on securing the financing, coming up with the optimal plan, building the plan, delivering, and then operating. And that was really the huge emphasis of any infrastructure project life cycle. I think what we heard from a variety of the participants in Istanbul was that paradigm has changed quite dramatically. And that instead, the period of time where you're doing public sector engagement in many ways covers the entire project life cycle, right? You can't have it derailed at any point along the project's life cycle. But what you need to do is really get those plans in place and secure, and be very transparent with the public about what the plan is, how the financing is going to be secured, what the cost will be to the end user, and really be transparent from the beginning. But that's a much bigger lift in the overall project at this point. And that's sort of the case whether it's in Chicago or Turkey or, really anywhere. Even, again, social media is changing a lot, right? So you saw earthquakes in China and buildings that had not been built to code, and there was a very big public response to that. Yes.
Hi, my name is Nalaini.
Hi.
Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
I've spent some time in China. I'm from India originally, and I know when you say that there's so much construction, I remember being woken up by the sound of cranes and hammers every single day. I have two questions. To me, I'm not quite so I know there's a lot of construction going on, and since all land is public land in China, it's by PPP, all the new construction, but should governments also think about how they're going to fund maintenance of these buildings in the future and not just new construction? And a lot of the environmental issues in China, including rising temperatures, have been linked to new construction. Is there any way they could still have new infrastructure in a more sustainable way that does not create more pollution or higher temperatures for people?
Well, those are really big public policy issues. So, my understanding in China is that they're sort of grappling with sort of a regulatory body, something akin to the Environmental Protection Agency, and sort of how that could help with the really pretty severe pollution from the incredible growth, right? So you can't, you don't want to diminish the incredible achievements in growth, but just from consumer, reading consumer press, and I guess I read Tom Friedman a lot, but I'm sure you guys probably do too. But there's a lot of green infrastructure actually in China, so there is sort of this movement, and again, it's sort of what consumers' aspirations or citizens' aspirations around the world are very similar, right? People want to be able to turn on a water faucet and get water. They want that water to be clean. And they want, to be able to breathe, And so I think that there seems to be efforts. Did you, after? Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, and then the other thing though I was going to say on the maintenance piece, yes, absolutely. That is, that's a big part of it, which is there has to be investment in the planning, the build, the operation, and the maintenance. And again, sort of our partners at McKenzie are saying, well, where you can really derive a lot of value, especially in these cash-strapped municipalities, is by looking at existing infrastructure and figuring out how to optimize it or maximize it. And that's certainly a big issue. But you saw on one of the slides, sort of there's this race for sort of bigger, better, et cetera. I think in India, the bullet train, we ended up talking to one of our India practice. Our India practice had us talk to sort of the father of infrastructure in India, Rakesh Mohan, and so we were talking about sort of what, especially big infrastructure projects are very in some ways they're very close to a nation's sort of sense of cultural identity. Right? And so maybe a bullet train or a high-speed train in some parts of the world may be looked at more aspirationally in terms of this is what we can do rather than what the end user actually needs or wants. But, and that's sort of, again, gets to sort of how McKinsey has looked at, again, having these conversations, which is how do we pick the right projects for the consumers in our city, our region, our country, because are we actually even building the right infrastructure? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sorry.
My name is Jeannie, and just to address Rani's question,
Okay.
last summer I actually interned in China at Bartels Institute, which, it's Hank Paulson's Later Institute, and anyway, I was focusing on urbanization, sustainable urbanization or urban sustainability. And so I can tell you that now the Chinese agenda is really has been really focusing on how to urbanize in a more sustainable way. And they've been changing the modes. Originally, they were trying to really just make the cities better with more infrastructure and basically with a higher living standards, and try to drive the people from the rural area into the urban areas. And since I think August, they've published something called, I don't remember, something blue papers. And anyways, basically is that the Chinese high-level officials are really trying to do it the other way. So instead of dragging people into the urban areas, they're trying to improve the living situation just in the rural areas so that people can stay there and have a happy life. Having said so, in China, there's still a lot of problem in terms of really giving a good report cards, as in you have to, being in turn for mayors, they have to be able to actually do something substantial number-wise so that they can be re-elected. And I think that's really the biggest problem, so just in my opinion, that in China they're facing in terms of urbanization and trying to strive for the balance between sustainability and urbanization.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hmm,
Sorry.
Great. No, it's great.
We're going to have time for about 2 more
Oh, okay.
questions.
Great.
There's someone who hasn't asked a question yet.
Right.
So we've had some questions about China, but my question is on sub-Saharan Africa, which has less than half of the coastline that China does. And there's like many disagreements over what is the primary reason behind sub-Saharan Africa's underdevelopment. And a lot of discussion is always on geography, and that their geography is like inherently the problem with, it's the reason behind their underdevelopment. But I'm wondering about infrastructure projects in Africa with the problem that there are very few natural waterways, and with air and land traffic being so expensive, and transportation of ideas really coming with transport as well. What kind of projects are there in Africa with the lack of transportation, really?
Yeah. Well, so there's a lot of transportation infrastructure projects. So there's probably, there's 1,500 infrastructure projects underway that are of sort of that reach a certain size that is able to be picked up by McKenzie analysis and data sort of troving. But it's there's a lot going on, and here's what's really interesting. So you have, first of all, you've got huge natural resources. That's always been the issue in Africa, and it's been dealt with very differently over a period of time. What you have now is starting with 2006, I think it was 2007, Ghana was the first of the countries that celebrated 50 years of independence. So you've got this new wave of the next 50 years of sort of Africa's history, right? And it's and the economies are really growing at a quite a nice clip, definitely outpacing global GDP growth. But what's really interesting is that global growth, that GDP growth in many ways is happening without really super sophisticated infrastructure in place. So you can only imagine what those numbers would look like with even greater infrastructure in place. There are so many resource finds that are taking place everywhere now, whether it's in Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda. It's just really, it's much more diverse now. And those, and so you have to really watch that. And that's why you have organizations like World Bank, Freedom House, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation sort of track these indicators, because many times when you look at countries that have a really amazing sort of investment dividend or dividend from natural resources, that's when you start to see the weakening of institutions. And so you're starting to see, just for instance, in Mozambique, you're starting to see just a little bit of a slip. Mozambique, they found the largest natural gas field, I think, ever off of the coast of Mozambique. Eni was the Italian company, was one of the big companies that was doing the exploration, and Anadarko. And that is going to provide a significant amount of money for Mozambique to be able to address its infrastructure issues. The question is sort of what, it gets to a lot of the different issues, again, that we're dealing with, which is like good governance, capacity. I've been in some of the conversations about should there be a separate PPP unit in Mozambique. There are real needs. The policymakers know what those needs are. Companies are there are planes that are landing every day from the big mineral companies to the engineering and construction firms, investors, and from all parts of the world, right? And so the issue is how can they get it right, And sort of what you want to say to, and I think what, people who are, for instance, partners with Albright Stonebridge Group and who have very good relationships with President Gubeza and others sort of say, look, there's a couple of different models out there. There's Botswana, close by. That's a great model. Yeah. It's a great model. Qatar, same sort of resource, right? That's a great model. you may want to do something a little bit different, perhaps, than Angola has done. You know, and to really sort of help, again, bring sort of the global community almost to bear, whether it's through finance, whether it's through public policy, whether it's through sort of traditional development assistance, you know, government assistance or whatever it is, to sort of say, you've got the opportunity to make a substantial change for the people of this country. And how do you harness sort of the ability of this significant fine to do that? But there's a lot going on. And here's the issue. That it's interesting because I think that when you look at when you talk about infrastructure challenges in Africa, it's almost a Western perspective to talk about it as challenges, you know? I mean, again, when you're at any airport in, you know, Nairobi or Joburg or elsewhere, there's a lot of Asian activity and investment in sub-Saharan Africa. Lack of roads, lack of power, lack of water infrastructure doesn't seem to be a problem. Like, that's like, great, we'll go in, we'll get it done so that we can get that bauxite or we can get, you know, whatever it is out. Now, as you have these African governments going into this, there's a much more sophisticated, there's a much better sense of how to work out concession arrangements. And there are fewer and fewer governments who are sort of saying, here's our timber, here's our oil, and please just build me a ministry of finance in return for all of it. That is happening. There's a little bit of the shine has come off of that model, I would say.
So please join me in thanking Ms.
Thank you very much.